All right, admitting a couple more people. There we go. All right, so welcome everybody to today's program, Getting Your Library AI Ready, hosted by the Laconia Technology section. My name is David Peterson. I'm the Technology Resources Librarian at the Prospect Heights Public Library. This program is being recorded today and will be shared to everybody afterwards. And questions will be taken at the end of the talk, but feel free to drop them in the chat and the Q&A as we go along. We may get to them as we go. But for now, I am going to introduce our speaker today. Nick Tanzi is a nationally recognized library technology consultant and author of the books Making the Most of Digital Collections Through Libraries and Outreach and Best Technologies for Public Libraries, Policies, Programs, and Services. Tanzi is a past column editor for Public Library Magazine, The Wired Library. His work has also been featured in publications including Computers and Libraries, Library Journal, and Marketing Library Services. So now I'm going to hand it over to Nick.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, artificial intelligence is obviously it's a topic that we went from not talking very much about to talking quite a bit about. It's a technology that I think produces feelings of excitement, anxiety, concern, fear, and all of these are appropriate emotions. Oftentimes we feel many of them simultaneously. So I want to talk a little bit about, though, how do we get our libraries AI ready as this technology becomes increasingly available to our public, to us ourselves, as it increasingly informs common software applications we use, as businesses adopt it, and it becomes an expectation that maybe the library provides similar functionality. So what will we be covering today? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about policy development. In my library career, I've worn many hats. I've been a page, a library clerk. I've been a librarian. I've worked in youth services. I've worked in adult reference. I've worked in digital services. And now I'm a library administrator and an assistant director in a public library. And as I've moved into management, more and more, I've seen the importance of policy. I don't find it terribly exciting, but I find it necessary. And it's really one of the bedrocks that we need to build on as we get our libraries prepared as we enter the age of AI. Then we're going to talk staff training. If we want to get our organizations ready, our organizations are staff powered, right? So our staff needs to be comfortable with these technologies in order for us to effectively navigate this new environment. We're going to go from staff-facing things to public-facing. Ultimately, this training, this policy, it all eventually impacts the services and programs we provide to our community. And what does that look like? And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, it's your questions. Want to leave some time at the end for Q&A. It's a great opportunity where if something was unclear to get some clarity from me. If you ask a question and I can't answer it because it's such an uncertain environment, I may say, I don't know. But it is an opportunity for you to get the most out of these types of events. So very cutesy image, right? As we establish that the age of AI is upon us. And it's not the greatest timing, I think, for us organizationally. We've gone through some interesting few years. It's been a fun time to be a public servant. And now here we are with a new, incredibly disruptive technology right on the heels of a previously very disruptive pandemic. What actually is the environment that we find ourselves in, though? Well, to my mind, we are trying to settle into the new normal, right? We've had several pandemic years of increasing virtualization of services, of impact to our physical locations, of us reimagining things, virtual programs, right? Of reinvestment and front-loading investment in our collections of ebooks and streaming media. And even as we imagine and try to settle into that new normal, now we have another giant disruptive event in artificial intelligence, which I think is a incredibly impactful technology, potentially on par with the rise of the internet, of the World Wide Web. It comes at a time when we work in increasingly virtual work environments that are collaborative. Think of your Google Workspace, think of your Office 365, think of how much business we do over Zoom now and other teleconferencing software. Um, so it really is coming at a time when our existence is more virtual than ever. And these technologies really can impact the workplace in ways that are much more intertwined with our day to day. The present environment is also one where there are a ton of AI tools that are widely available. Our public can get to them. There's often not a cost that's incurred in terms of access, at least not a financial cost. One of the laws of the internet is that when something is free, it means you're the product, right? And many of these AI tools are free because they are training off of that human feedback, that human interaction. They're processing that, they're storing that as data, potentially to improve their models. So in this weird environment where there's lots of stuff out there, lots of it is free in the financial sense, but at the same time, it's the Wild West. There's no rules, right? It's largely an unregulated industry. There's lots of questions about copyright. What does this mean? Copyright law is trying to catch up to this technology. Privacy law is trying to catch up. We're having discussions about what you should and shouldn't do with AI. There's no rules for etiquette as it stands right now. And businesses are growing fast, something like ChatGPT that's now valued at $80 billion. So it's a great combination of no rules and wide access, right? And little understanding. It's certainly a potential for some pitfalls there. And then one of the other uncomfortable aspects of this technology is that there's lots of questions from patrons and staff, and we don't have all the answers, right? We are very much the figure it out generation. Future generations will learn this stuff in school. For us, it's been dropped in our lap. We have to understand how it works. And then we have to make that quick pivot to training other people, our fellow staff, and of course, our public that have many of the same questions that we ourselves have. So it's a great time to be alive, is what I'm saying. Now, broadly speaking, this is what implementation may look like for you. Again, policy and procedure is foundational. Having policy and procedure in place is going to add clarity to what's an otherwise unclear environment. It tells you what you can and can't do and how you go about doing that. Then there's experimentation. Once some guardrails are in place, we interact with these technologies, we understand them better, and then we go to adoption. And adoption is both choosing what tools to invest in, but also how we invest in staff in the form of training. So start with policy, you move to experimenting, to experiential learning, and then finally we adopt. We take these tools on, we integrate them into library services where appropriate, right? And then it translates to oftentimes public-facing services, programs, and the like. Now you'll see none of these processes are as linear as I would like them to be. There's some backsliding, there's some circular activity with this, but broadly speaking, this is what we're looking at. So again, I want to start with AI policy and procedure. You may be in a position to be writing policy. You may not be in a position to be writing policy, but I think there's still an opportunity to inform policy where your interactions with AI, if you find it lacking, if you find it unclear, that's a good thing to communicate to the organization because it's a potential pitfall. We all are trying to operate in an environment where there's not a lot of clarity. And policy is one way for us to add some clarity, at least as it exists, at least as it pertains to the library environment. Two long, boring definitions that I think are important to actually to absorb and to understand. When we talk about policy, when we talk about procedure, because these are parallel, but they have a relationship and it's easy for one to bleed into the other. When we're talking policy, and this is from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a policy is a general written document that establishes a standard by which the institution manages its affairs. A policy mandate specifies or prohibits conduct in order to enhance the institution's mission, ensure coordinated compliance with applicable laws and regulations, promote operational efficiency, and/or reduce institutional risk. So again, that first sentence is key. So general written document, it establishes a standard by which the institution manages its affairs. How are we going to go about our business? And then everything else is about managing risk, complying with existing laws and regulations, being efficient. Procedure is basically how you achieve that. Procedure is a description of the operational processes necessary to implement policy. Policy is the standards, the rules. Procedure is how you comply with that, how you stay in compliance, how you do the thing. If we understand the nuance and the difference between policy and procedure, we also have to understand that legal and ethical are not the same. Sometimes they are. We'd like to think that our laws are informed by our ethics, but it's not always the case. And this is particularly important when we look at artificial intelligence. Many of us are in a holding pattern, right? Waiting to see what laws come out, what regulations come out, with the hopes that it will kind of rid ourselves of these sticky ethical questions. But you can't really count on that. For example, the copyright decisions that are kind of we're waiting to see happen regarding is ChatGPT that oftentimes has entire books inside of its training model. Is that a form of copyright violation? Is generative AI, text to image generators that create images, are they contravening copyright law for the artist? We may find that, at least as the law views it, no, it is not a violation of copyright. So then you have to decide on the ethical take, which is different. To what degree do you make sure that rights holders are compensated? To what degree do you invest in software and platforms that meet those ethical requirements that are different from the law? So while some of this may be resolved in time with the law, some of it may not, and we may need to look inward and look at our professional ethics. This is not necessarily a new position for us, right? I think that libraries oftentimes operate like software companies. We have all this software that does our websites, our calendar system, program registration, our digital collections of ebooks and streaming media, of our databases, chat, text, email, all of these widgets. We have so much software going on, right? We're on social media, we do all these things. So we function as software companies to some degree, but at the same time, the difference between us and big tech is like that respect for privacy. That's how we differentiate ourselves. And in the age of AI, having a vision of ethical AI, having standards that respect free inquiry, but also user privacy, that potentially have a better relationship with creators, with rights holders, I think is important. So that is the opportunity, is articulating a vision of ethical AI, one that may be at odds with how other folks are doing it in big tech. Transparency. So if we start with policy development, why do we do it? Well, this is a way of adding clarity to the unclear situation. Policy is going to add clarity for staff and patrons. Tells you what you do and why you do it and how you achieve it, right? Well, at least with the procedure aspect, which is important because staff is confused right now. We don't know what's right or what's appropriate. We have a sense of it, but it needs to be articulated in a document. Having a stated policy is also going to help you decide on what tools you use and how you use them. You'll have a point of comparison, a policy document to compare against things like terms of service. Again, more clarity to that situation. And then, of course, it will inform procedure. Once you have a policy in place, you can have procedure to help stay in compliance. The combination of those things, policy and procedure, will then allow you to train staff. You'll have a baseline of, you know, how we go about our business, what that looks like in the day-to-day, what use cases are appropriate and what is not. It'll give you a sense of what you can invest in terms of tools, right? And when you know what you're investing in, then you know what to train on. So one flows from the other. So some considerations when you're writing AI policy. My favorite question to always ask myself anytime I'm doing technology policy or any policy in particular is, do I actually need a new policy? It's always good to stop and think about that. Because potentially, can you just view a new technology, in this case, artificial intelligence, through an existing policy lens? Can I say, does policy I already have on the books perhaps deal with this seemingly new situation? So first thing you should do is just look at your existing policy. See to what degree it handles some of those sticky ethical questions. Um, you can also look at the law. Compliance with the law is kind of important. It's often foundational to policy. So look at state, local, and federal laws. My suspicion is when you do this, it doesn't say very much about artificial intelligence, right? We have a recent executive order. That's about the most we have to play with. That being said, the law tends to say quite a bit on privacy and on libraries and things like the confidentiality of patron records. One thing you may want to do is look at things like the Illinois Library Records Confidentiality Act and say, to what degree is using some of these tools, when you look at the terms of service, does it contravene that law or not? Potentially, it's just use of the software, or it may be the use case itself. What you do with it oftentimes is the trigger. There are oftentimes ways to deal ethically and legally with a piece of software, with a platform, with a tool, and there are also ways to abuse it. But that is a good thing to check. Some considerations you're going to want to have is things like transparency with your public. When you're using AI, how you're using AI, intellectual honesty, are you crediting these things? All of those sticky ethical concerns, intellectual property, fair compensation for creators, acknowledgement that these technologies can be flawed and biased, that there are algorithmic bias. Algorithmic bias meaning there are groups that are consistently disadvantaged by technology. A good example would be something like, so let's get a little meta. A lot of schools, for example, using software like Turnitin to check to see if a book report, for example, is AI authored. Well, this software that checks these things that's AI powered will falsely flag writing by non-native English speakers between 58 and 98% of the time. It'll think that it's AI generated when it's not. It was written by somebody that just English is not their first language. So that particular group is consistently disadvantaged by some iterations of AI. And then finally, when you're writing AI policy, your common kind of task is going to be to look at the tool, the platform, the software, and its terms of services, that binding agreement that they have when you use the thing. Compare that to your existing policy, compare that to current laws governing libraries, confidentiality, and make sure that there's not an issue there. So if that's policy, what might procedure govern? Well, as I mentioned, it may mean that part of your procedure is when you're using an AI tool or considering using one, that you make sure that you check the terms of service prior to using it and knowing what the red flags are. And then you can develop a list of appropriate use cases, appropriate software that you can use without having to be worried. Although know that terms of service are updated and it will require you to look at it again. It's not a one and done scenario. You may make it a business practice that you will require that platforms fairly compensate creators. There is software that, for example, well, there's generators that just they spit the stuff out. They've clearly digested and been trained on copyrighted material, and nothing flows back to the copyright holder, to the creator. Then there's things like Getty Images that are presenting themselves as alternative, ethical alternatives that they allegedly, and you got to hold their feet to the fire and make sure it's true, but that they compensate their rights holders. It's a closed ecosystem, and they know who that royalty check goes to. Adobe similarly says they're ethically sourcing their images for their training model. So that may be something that you do as well. You may need to, as part of the transparency aspect, make sure that you make it a kind of part of your operating procedure, that you have a thing in place to cite generative AI. That you mentioned what it was used, you have some standardization about it. And then data retention. Um, some systems are more closed, and in that case, you have to decide what you're doing with this when patron information goes into this stuff. Is there a data retention schedule? Are you ensuring that stuff isn't going to third parties? Some of these things feel new. Some of these things are new variations of things we've always done. We've always had a very complicated relationship with things like the patron reading history, right? Some folks are okay with that, some folks are not. We make it optional. Is it stored locally? These are kind of new versions of old questions. Now, more certainty is coming. The longer we wait, the more we know, right? Very recently, President Biden, he saw that I had some slides that he needed to blow up, so he dropped an executive order that said quite a bit. It was named the Executive Order on the Safe, Secure, and Trustworthy Development and Use of Artificial Intelligence. It has a lot in it. A lot of it is a plan to develop a plan. It's basically directing government agencies, Department of Education, for example, to come up with a toolkit for schools and ways to mitigate algorithmic bias. Department of Commerce to come up with a plan. It's a lot of the regulatory information will be here 1 year from now. That's basically the amount of lead time they've been given. It also has some minor details like please don't develop bioweapons using AI. I think that's a healthy thing to ask for. So it's got a lot going on. But even then, some of the most potentially impactful aspects of it, safety testing, all of these things are nice, but much of it is voluntary. But it's going to be what the government does 1 year from now when a lot of these plans have to be hatched at the kind of federal department level. On August 30th, the U.S. Copyright Office also opened public comments on copyright. It's since been closed. They have over 10,000, I believe in the realm of 12,000 comments that went through, that they are commenting on the comments. So U.S. Copyright Office is digesting this as well, and hopefully more certainty comes there on what this all means for copyright. Can you interpret this new technology with existing copyright law? Does it need a new framework? There's also several copyright lawsuits that are going on. Any number of authors are suing companies like ChatGPT, Sarah Silverman, for example, saying their books were digested, basically. And that feels like a copyright violation, but the time will tell, the law will tell. European Union has been working on comprehensive AI legislation. They actually started fairly early, but it's been going on so long that there is some concern about what finally comes out. Are they fighting the last battle? Is it a contemporary law, or is it something that didn't age well? The hope is, though, is that they have something quite comprehensive that comes out in 2024. And what happens in Europe can dictate what happens in the United States with internet companies, internet-based companies. We've seen this with privacy law. Now, knowing that certainty comes eventually, it can be quite tempting, right? To just say, I'm just going to wait and see how this all shakes. And it's not a terrible instinct, right? We like certainty. We like to build on a firm foundation, not a foundation of sand. But I think there are things we can still do. So what is the best use of our time while this landscape settles? How can we best spend our time? And this is why I encourage experimentation. This is a good time to experiment, but experiment safely. Um, Partly why I say policy is so important is that you can put some guardrails in place. You can say, hey, we do not, as an organization, take our patrons' um, personally identifiable information and drop it into ChatGPT, for example. When staff is clear on that, they are able to experiment with some parameters that will make them less likely to make catastrophic mistakes, right? They're still going to make mistakes. Mistakes are essential to learning, but you want them to be minor mistakes, mistakes that don't break the public trust, for example. Why do I encourage experimentation? Well, so many of us have maker spaces, right? And why do we do that? Well, it's an opportunity for hands-on experiential learning. You learn by doing. And the key to this is demystifying AI for staff. So much of what we feel about AI, whether it's we like it, we hate it, we're scared of it, much of it is based on imagination or anticipation. It's not based on interaction, reality. The best thing you can do is learn how it works so you can speak authoritatively. So you may still hate AI or you may love AI, but it's rooted in experience. I know this because I did this. I saw how this works. I've seen the good and the bad, and I'm making an informed decision. Experimentation is also important because AI is a broad term. It means a lot of things to a lot of people. AI can do a lot of things. ChatGPT can be applied to any number of things, some good, some bad. Um, but it's potentially a productivity tool, many of these things, and it can be applied to very different work. We all use and interact with these systems very differently. So there's no A to Z, A to B to Z kind of clear path on this. We will all interact with these systems differently. Experimentation is important because you will discover use cases that are good, bad, inappropriate, effective, ineffective. But it's rarely a binary thing. The other reason why experimentation is so important is that AI functionality is coming to common software and operating systems. Windows 11 very soon is going to have Windows Copilot. It's Windows AI powered operating system. You will have like the AI version of Clippy, remember from the old Microsoft Office, from Windows, Microsoft Word. You had your virtual assistant who just like gave you unhelpful how-to tips and did FAQs. You will be able to talk to your operating system. You will be able to engage in generative AI and make images for your PowerPoint slides, for your flyers. You will be able to have your operating system read and summarize PDFs, for example, Word documents. Uh, Things like Google Workspace will be able to revise the tone. It can do this now with, if you turn on Google Labs, can revise the tone of emails, can offer suggestions, can correct or generate text, much like ChatGPT. This functionality is coming to software that we already use. It's in Canva, it's coming to Windows, it's in Google Workspace. So just to use the current software that we do as it continues to evolve, we need to experiment. We need to get comfortable. So I really think that this is time well spent while we wait for that regulatory environment to take shape, while we see what the law says, while we see what copyright says, while we see what companies rise and fall, what goes away, what stays. My strong suggestion to you is to consider an AI user group. This is something we're doing at South Huntington. Come up with a user group, you set some goals. What are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to demystify AI for the users? Are you trying to discover what you should and shouldn't do? Are you trying to identify good tools? Are you trying to help inform what policy you need? You come up with a composition of the group. Who makes it up? Is it just your techie staff? I don't suggest that. I think it should be broad-based. I think it's important to remember we say that we all interact with these technologies differently. I want people from every department in my library. I want my support staff involved. I want my librarians. I want my IT guys, my IT employees. I want everybody involved in this because they'll have different perspectives. They'll interact with these technologies differently, and they'll see where it works and where it doesn't, where it's appropriate or not. They'll come up with questions I hadn't anticipated. And then you have to come up with a meeting structure. How often do you meet? For how long? What do you do in these meetings? Do you assign homework? What is the approach here? So just a spotlight on how we're doing things at South Huntington. This is a fairly recent group we formed. It's been around about a month or two, closer to two. And we formed a user group basically to give staff an outlet, partly a creative outlet for those folks who are excited about this technology, but also kind of like a form of group therapy where we can commiserate, where folks can share their fears and their concerns. And we need to listen to those critical voices about this technology. Um, we can't turn into AI evangelists that ignore potential pitfalls. Just because somebody is maybe doesn't like the technology, they're not necessarily a Debbie Downer. We can be quite wrong about this technology, and we need to listen to those critical voices and see, can we ethically engage with AI, and what does that mean? So I tend to welcome skeptics into this group. I think it's important. But I do want their skepticism to be rooted, again, in how the technology actually works, not in how they fear it or what they heard, or one individual use case that, yes, is terrible, but is not a way that we're going to interact with the technology. We did this as an open invite. I invited all staff. Had a very big doodle poll that we tried to come up with matching schedules as best we could. And currently, if my library has 68 employees, that's everyone. That's all our pages, all our custodial staff, IT, clerks, librarians, admin, everyone. So out of that pool of 68 potential employees, 16 folks were able to take us up on the offer. They work in youth services, they work in computer services, they work in young adult, they work in adult services, they work in a digital services group. We have admins in this group. There are part-time folks and there are full-time. It is a pretty nice representative mix, which I think is essential. And our format right now, granted, the first meeting, we kind of talked about our goals. What are we trying to do? And it was, again, to demystify the technology, to give staff a sounding board, to get them to understand how things work and to show us what they can do with it, making no assumptions, and give them some guardrails to do it. After that kind of initial meeting, what do we generally do? Well, we'll demonstrate a tool and show how it can be used. Sometimes that means watching a video. Sometimes that means a demonstration by a staff member who's more familiar with the technology. So we'll take ChatGPT. We'll show them some basic prompt structures. We'll show them some of how we can use it, and we being the person who's demonstrating it, who will interact with that technology differently. I'm going to do a brainstorming session and see how we can come up with program ideas. I'm trying to name a program. I'm, bandying some ideas back and forth with it. I'm using it to restructure a sentence or a paragraph so that it's now written for a fifth grader. Those types of things. Then, after we've kind of seen how it works, we assign some homework. We take questions, we see if everybody understands. Sometimes we'll hands-on demonstrate this, But then going with the ChatGPT example, I might say, okay, use it to brainstorm as a brainstorming tool that's in line with some of your work functions. It might be programming, it might be, writing a memo, it might be any number of things. Use it as a creative tool. Have it correct a piece of writing that you've written. Those types of things. And then, some things that give it more of a leash where you say, just straight up write a thing. And then we meet back and we discuss. Everybody shares their experiences. It did this very well. It did this poorly. Um, it worked kind of, or it got this wrong. People see the limits of the technology and also the promise of what it does. And they're interacting with it in a way that is in line with their expertise. My IT guys are using it to try to troubleshoot code. My children's programmers are coming up with names of their pet parade, all sorts of things. Um, and then we compare those experiences. And then it's a rinse and repeat. Then we introduce a new tool. And the next thing we did after ChatGPT was text to image generators. We showcased a few different things from Midjourney to Microsoft's image creator that's powered by DALL-E 3 now. And we'll meet back, we'll discuss this, we'll see what it does, what it can't do. We discuss the ethics of these things as well. Overwhelmingly, though, as we're choosing these tools, what is informing that? Well, our focus is on broad functionality. And what I mean by that is, like ChatGPT is a great stand-in for understanding large language models, LLMs, that do natural language processing. They can create incredible text based on prompts you give them. Then we do things like conversational search, Google Bard and Google Bing, Google Bard and Microsoft's Bing AI-powered search engines, and show how those work and play with them and understand them better. Generative AI, text-to-image generators, and all of these broad functions then are moving towards the more complicated things, which are AI-powered workspace software. We've got a computer that we're designating as the experimental, not on the network Windows 11 Copilot computer, where folks can play with that operating system that's AI powered that takes all of these tools and functionalities together. We're working on Google Workspace, turning on Google's Google Labs. From a network administrator, kind of has to turn that switch on. Things like Canva that are a whole suite of many pieces of software of many types of functionality that can all work together, but understanding them individually and then applying them all at once is helpful for us. What are my short-term and kind of medium-term goals? I won't go long-term. I don't know what the long-term is with some of this stuff, but those shorter and bit longer-term goals for us. Well, in the short term, the most important thing is I want to demystify the technology for staff. I want them to just understand how it works, what it can do, what it's good at, what it's bad at, what are the concerns we have, and, just see where they're at with it. And what I find fascinating about it is some of my folks who were very AI positive have gotten a little more, not grim on the technology, but they've seen the limitations of it. They have a better understanding. They're less enthusiastic about it, in that they don't think that the possibilities are endless. They can see what it does well and what it does not so great. And some of my folks who are quite frightened of the technology are less so when they see ChatGPT and understand that actually it's probabilistic AI that is a super fancy autocomplete. It just mathematically determines what's the most likely letters, words, sentences, paragraphs that would come next after a prompt. So it moves the dial for everybody, and it's all rooted in reality, which is what I prefer. As an administrator, what I like about this user group is it applies a good stress test for my existing library policy. It's going to tell me very quickly, man, I need to write new policy, or no, our existing policy on the confidentiality of patron records is enough. But again, that isn't going to be based on guesswork by me. It's going to be based on actuality. It's also going to help us determine appropriate tools and use cases. We're going to see this. We're going to see where it contravenes policy or not. We're going to see what it does well or not. And then what does that mean? Well, it'll help us decide on what to invest in. So the longer term goals is going to be building policy that lasts. It's going to be train the trainer. Eventually, I need to train these folks. These folks are already kind of pre-trained on much of this. And then they can re-infiltrate their various departments because there's a broad spectrum of staff that are learning these tools. So when it comes time to formally investing in software, in platforms, and understanding what's appropriate use cases and having policy in place, then these folks are going to hit the ground running and help me train other people so that organizationally we can train up quite quickly. And I want to develop community AI navigators. That's really a fancy way of saying I want my staff to be able to teach. I want them to be able to talk confidently about this stuff, to train our patrons, and to be able to sit on committees that are going to dictate where this technology goes. So that when local government is looking at this, when there is policies, like actual government action, and they want people to give an informed perspective, we can talk informed about this and talk persuasively about this technology. Now we move on to implementation. What does implementation actually look like? Well, remember, it all kind of flows somewhat linear, in a linear fashion. We have appropriate policy and procedure in place, and this is communicated to staff. The stuff is useless if staff doesn't know it exists. We invest in appropriate AI tools. We decide we have a policy in place, we know what use cases are good or bad, and then we can make investments. One thing to understand is while we think of things like ChatGPT and we think of things like Midjourney and all of these as standalone technologies, AI functionality is coming to us in the form of our traditional library vendors, our EBSCO hosts, Elsevier, all of our databases, many of our digital content providers. They're going to be shopping different AI solutions to us. And we need to be able to critically evaluate them. That's why a policy is important. That's why us understanding the functionality is important. And then these changes are coming to Windows Copilot, to Google Workspace, and we're going to need to absorb those changes organizationally. The AI user group is not a replacement for formal training. It's a pre-training. It's figuring out what we want to train on. It's getting folks comfortable with functionalities, but ultimately, they're going to help us decide what tools we use, what use cases, what policy needs to be in place, and then we train everybody formally on things that we select that are ethical or can be used ethically if we follow our policy and procedure. And then the last piece is going to be those public-facing programs conducted by staff. Yes, we can find people to go and teach these classes, but I think this technology is important enough, and it's going to be so integrated in our day-to-day work that I think that ultimately staff is the best trainer in the same way that one-on-one tech appointments are so important. We have public trust, and there's a lot of concern, consternation, fear about this technology. I think it needs to come from a friendly face. So when we develop programs, what should our programming focus on? This may surprise you, but it's a lot like what our user group looked like. It's going to initially be demystifying the technology, getting these popular tools in front of people, but adding context, showing them how they work, what they can do, how they can interact with them, but in a way that doesn't compromise their safety. It's also going to be navigating the media literacy environment. The information environment has changed, and fake news now has been, weaponized, and it has superpowers. We're in the era of code your own reality, where any of us can use generative AI, text to image generators, to make fake images that look realistic. And so traditional media literacy is as important as ever. It's going to mean applying things like the crap test to this new media, this AI generated media. It's also, when we think about media literacy, remember part of it isn't just accessing technology and media, it's the creation of. So we need to show folks how these generative tools work, what prompt structures look like, teach AI literacy so that they can try this stuff out and effectively navigate this new environment. Much like with the rise of social media, we need to teach our patrons how to interact with these systems safely, show them some of their privacy concerns. They can manage their digital privacy in a changed environment. The business community oftentimes has questions. We show them how to develop websites, how to do things like social media marketing. There are business applications for many of these tools, things like chatbots, things like data processing. And as we get more confident, that's something we can look at as well. And then don't think of AI as a standalone. It's not just the classes on AI specifically, but AI can be infused into non-tech classes. Um, if you're doing a creative writing class, using ChatGPT as a brainstorming tool, not as a write the thing for me tool, can be quite effective. It can give you good prompts, writing prompts. And there'll be, there's plenty of ways to integrate AI technology into non-AI specific classes. It's just another way to interact with information. Well, how is AI going to impact services? Well, one of the things we need to understand is AI is kind of operating the inverse way that most technologies work. In the past, a new technology comes out, it's prohibitively expensive, and then it gets cheaper over time, right? And we give access early on because it's cost prohibitive, and then we can back off as it becomes more inexpensive and readily available for our patrons. In the case of AI, it actually is starting out where a lot of it's free because they're building a customer base, because they're building a database functionally, a training model with that human interaction. And then over time, they're going to be applying costs, pricing model, tiered access. If you want the primo version of ChatGPT, you got to pay for it. And as folks get priced out, as the cost becomes a barrier to access, the library will be able to offer access to AI as a service in and itself. We're also going to see that library databases, collections, they're all going to be infused with AI. You can check out on YouTube something like Scopus AI, where databases will use natural language processing, conversational search. You'll talk to them like you talk to a person, no Boolean, and it will be more conversational, the nature of research. And as this stuff becomes more and more in the private sector widely available, we know that folks come to us expecting a similar experience to retail. They want to check out ebooks the way they buy ebooks on eBay. They want to do grab and go services with the library the way they can pick up the order from Target. So they're going to come to us expecting similar functionality. We need to make sure that we can do that ethically, right? We're going to see the rise of chatbots, which can be good, they can be bad, they can be privacy disasters, or they can be quite closed ecosystems. The library is a complex website. We have so many third-party services, but these things can be effective wayfinding. They can take you to where you need to go and do the handoff, and take you to a database, find our hours of operation, digest policy documents. And we often sell our organizations, our digital branch is open 24/7, but it's not really if there's no help available after hours. So all of these potential offerings need to be done in a way that ensures compliance with policy and those professional ethics that we have, commitment to privacy, transparency, um, you know, regular data retention that's not problematic. Some final thoughts. I think I mentioned, I feel like, you know, policy is foundational. Yes, policy is often boring. It does not spark joy in me to write policy, but so much of this flows from policy. And policy is a way for you to create some certainty. We can wait quite a long time to see what the European Union does. Legislatively in the United States, it's moving very, very slow. Yes, there's an executive order that feels like some certainty, but not really. Most of those decisions happen 1 year later when we see what the Board of Ed does, the Department of Education does, when we see what the Commerce Department does. And the nature of executive orders are the same president can remove it with a stroke of a pen. If somebody else is elected president, they can change it, get rid of it with the stroke of a pen. So it's certainty, but it isn't. Our own policy, especially as it pertains to ethics, professional ethics, is a way to create certainty, and we can do it right now. If it's contravened by law, we may have to back it up, but it is a way for us to act with more immediacy than perhaps our government has with this. While we wait for more clarity to come, we want to make sure that that is time well spent, that we're not just standing pat. And that is why I feel like experimentation is so important. Demystifying the technology, getting involved in discussions about what ethical AI looks like, and communicating a vision of it, of making sure that when we talk about it, it's on the real, it's not on the imagined, and that we get used to certain functionalities that are coming to your office software, that's coming to your operating system, that's coming to everything from PowerPoint to Adobe, and that we understand how it works, so when we're not kind of caught flat-footed as there's an operating system update. And again, the fact that AI has real ethical issues is in itself an opportunity, because the opportunity lies in us building an ethical alternative. If saying like, yeah, that stuff is bad, but here we have, for example, a database that's AI powered where you know what went into it. It's not black box AI where it's all a mystery. It's curated content that is quality. It's transparent what's in it, and your data isn't shared with a third party, right? That's much more attractive than using ChatGPT and saying, hey, it might lie to you, but up to 40% of the time. You don't know what went in it. None of the rights holders are compensated, and it's actively data mining you. So yes, we can communicate an ethical alternative that is in itself a selling point, makes the library an attractive alternative. Never mind that we can also take cost out of the equation for the patron. This is my contact information. At this point, I'm happy to take any questions you may have. I know it's quite a bit to cover. Just saying, hey, this is how you can transform your your library under very fast-moving, changing circumstances without much clarity in the regulatory environment. But I think this is a good roadmap, although you may disagree, to both getting policy in place, doing what the considerations are, to experimenting, to training up staff, to then translating it into services for our public. Any questions? I mean, feel free to drop them in the chat. Otherwise, I will assume this was so comprehensive that there's nothing more to be said. Okay, so I'm getting some chats. It seems generally positive sentiment, which is nice. But feel free to engage critically as well. It's an important part of learning. Let's see, the question came in, do you have any examples of current terms of service that may interfere with library services? Well, a lot of what happens is it's a combination of not just, yes, there's some terms of services that are concerning, right? You look at ChatGPT and how they collect information, right? Their data retention is concerning to me. So then it becomes more a matter of what am I putting into the system? It becomes procedural more than policy. If I'm not putting in personally identifiable information, then I am much more comfortable with using that system, if that makes sense. So there may be times when you look and you say, absolutely not. Um, those occasions are more like when you look at a use case or I'm sorry, a terms of service, and it's not even what you're putting in. It's a plugin that's actively harvesting data without your consent, with you having no control over what's going into the system. It would be a more concerning, absolutely not type of scenario. So I see there's a question, are there examples of what database vendors, EBSCO, Gale, ProQuest, et cetera? So I know that Sage Publishing is quite active in working with AI. I know Elsevier is coming up with Scopus AI, and you can Google that. They have like a whole little promo video on how that works. So they're absolutely integrating. Um, think of if you've used Bing's search engine, it feels a little bit like that. It's conversational search. Then it gives you a paragraph or more answer, and it's citing stuff within the database that's linked data that you can get to. So it's not just you're doing a search and it's giving you like 20 or 30 articles. It's actually answering it and then providing the source material with inline citations that then link to those specific articles. So the question is, in our AI group, do we discuss staff fears of jobs being replaced by AI? Yes, some folks are very much on this, call it a committee, but this user group, because they fear for their jobs, right? And I think what's helpful is when they see the limitations of AI, what it does well, what it doesn't do so well, it can take some of that fear away. It is tricky because if we're being intellectually honest, if I say, yes, AI is collaborative and it is a productivity tool, well, if one person can do the work of two, right, there is a concern there. What we try to communicate for folks is, and I can only speak to our organization, right, but I think communication is very important. Libraries work because of staff. And I think that folks who, sometimes misunderstand, these are similar conversations that we had in the 90s, right? Do we need librarians when we have Google, when we have the internet? And what we found is that the nature of work changes. The last few years, technical services have not been a growth industry. Some work is replaced, some work is outsourced and done more quickly. But we've reinvested in other areas that are quite time intensive. Creating virtual programs now for two very different user groups takes a lot of time. Um, Outreach efforts take a tremendous amount of time. So yes, I think it's important to show them and have honest discussions about what AI can do well, what it can't do well. And some of those fears go away. And sometimes folks have new fears because they say, hey, it can do stuff that I can do. But those are organizational decisions. Those are community decisions, right? The decision to invest in library staff. I don't know that necessarily AI avoidance is really the way to go with that. So great question. I think you need to have honest conversations, and I think you need to think about what are those important things you're doing. I know that at my library, we all have kind of our jobs feel like to-do lists that never end. And a productivity tool isn't something that scares me in that sense, because we have a community that values the library. We have a board that understands what the librarians do, what library staff do, and value that.
That looks like it for questions then. So thank you, Nick, for the presentation.
Thank you.
I thought it was very good. And thank you all for joining us today. Again, for those who missed the beginning of the program, this is being recorded right now, so whoever did miss it will be able to catch up on that. And thank you, and all have a good day.